Hi, my name is Andrew Henry.
And I'm Dr. Hussein Rashid.
And this is Religion for Breakfast, Intro to Islam.
With over 1.8 billion followers around the world, that's billion with a B, 1/4 of the world's population, very few people know a lot about Islam. We tend to think about it in terms of the news headlines, which include groups like Al-Qaeda or Daesh, the so-called Islamic State. But that tends to read the religion as being very political and therefore oversimplifies it.
What is missing here is a more sophisticated understanding of Islam. So what we're going to do in this video is try to add a methodology that gets us beyond the simple content. Of course, it's important to learn about the founder, the sacred texts, the houses of worship, basic beliefs and practices, but it's just as important to understand that Islam is a religion that has evolved over time, that is internally diverse, and is embedded in cultures around the world. That is to say, how Islam manifests itself differently, whether you're in Indonesia, the United Kingdom, or Saudi Arabia. So with that, let's get into it.
The religion that we call Islam first originated in the Arabian Peninsula to a man named Muhammad. He would go to a cave and pray by himself. And according to Muslim belief, the angel Gabriel comes to Muhammad and commands him to Iqra. Iqra means to read or recite. And it is at this moment that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, is believed to receive the first revelation from Gabriel that gave him God's word in Arabic. Muhammad would continue to receive revelation over the next 23 years of his life that would form the text of what was known as the Quran. This text was compiled after his death, but for Muslims, the totality of the text was revealed during Prophet Muhammad's lifetime and is a complete revelation. For Muslims, they consider Muhammad the last prophet, and they consider the Quran the final revelation.
The Quran is also thought to be an oral text. That is to say, a text that is not just read, but is heard and spoken. After all, the angel Gabriel said to Muhammad, recite. Because of this, using the original Arabic and using correct pronunciation is critical when reciting the Quran. And in fact, translations of the Quran into other languages are thought to just be interpretations of the Quran because so much is thought to be lost in the process of translation. Moreover, daily recitation of the Quran is a vital part of ritual practice for Muslims worldwide. For example, many Muslims pray the opening 7 verses of the Quran, an invocation called the Fatiha, every day at the beginning of each cycle of prayer, as well as at special occasions like funerals, weddings, or births, and even for daily events like travel or before taking an exam.
The Fatiha is the first chapter or surah of the Quran. The Quran itself is made up of 114 surahs or chapters, and only about 5% of the text is legalistic in the sense of thou shalt not. The majority of the text is moral and ethical guidance and stories. The 7 verses contained in this chapter really synthesize what it means to be Muslim. The verses talk about God's compassion and mercy, God's rulership over the heavens and the earth, over all of creation, and that God will judge us on the day of judgment. It also talks and really emphasizes God's oneness or unity. For Muslims, this is a key theological idea, the oneness of God. So ideas of the Christian Trinity or Zoroastrian dualism were seen as an affront to the oneness of God. And so the Fatiha, as does the rest of the Quran, really emphasizes this oneness or tawheed.
Now remember at the start of the video I said that religions are internally diverse. Now this sounds like a no-brainer. Of course religions are diverse, but how many of you have seen Islam represented as a monolithic entity or heard someone say like, Muslims believe that or Muslims believe this? To which I ask, well, which Muslims are you talking about? This religion is incredibly diverse and there's a wide range of interpretations and a wide range of observations of their practices. The scholar Edward Said even once said that it's best to speak of Islam rather than Islam, because once one gets a tiny step beyond core beliefs and the centrality of the Quran, one has entered an astoundingly complicated world. So keep this in mind whenever you're learning about Islam. We can generalize about the beliefs and practices, but there's almost always exceptions.
There are 2 major communities of Muslims that we can talk about today, the Sunni and the Shia. The first community to come together historically are the Shia, which is short for the Shiat Ali or the supporters of Ali. This group believes that Muhammad named his cousin and son-in-law Ali as his divinely appointed successor. Ali becomes the first Imam. But even within the Shia, there are diversity of interpretations. So the largest group of Shia that we may be familiar with is the Ashri or the Twelver community. The Twelvers believe that the 12th Imam goes into occultation. That is, he will return at the end times when he will be joined by Jesus to fight the Antichrist. Another group of Shia are known as the Ismailis, and the Ismailis can be further subdivided. But one of the groups that we want to mention today are called the Nizari Ismailis. They're the only Shia group to have a living imam today, whom they recognize as the Aga Khan IV. Another important group of Shia who have a different theology than both the Twelvers and the Ismailis are called the Zaydis. They're found predominantly in Yemen and follow Muhammad's great-grandson Zayd ibn Ali and believe in a different type of succession than both the Ithna Ashri and the Ismaili communities. Today, the Shias make up about 10 to 13% of the worldwide population and are found throughout the world.
Sunnis account for somewhere between 87 and 90% of Muslims worldwide. They differ from Shias in the succession of the caliph. Rather than Ali, they chose a close friend of Muhammad, Abu Bakr, to succeed. But even within Sunni Islam, there's a lot of diversity. So, for example, there are 4 main schools of Sunni jurisprudence: Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, each named after prominent scholars from Muslim history. But even a simple delineation between Sunni and Shia Islam doesn't capture the full diversity. Many people think of Arabs whenever they think of Muslims, but actually the largest Muslim populations are in Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India.
There's also another interpretation or another approach to being Muslim called Sufi Islam. Now, to be a Sufi doesn't mean you're not Sunni or Shi'i. It means that you approach a practice to your worship that seeks to emphasize personal piety and bring yourself closer to God. We've mentioned the major Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi, who's been a best-selling poet in America for years. He was also a Muslim legal scholar and founded a Sufi order known as the Mevlevi order, sometimes called the whirling dervishes, whirling through turning on their foot to bring themselves closer to God. There are also major Sufi pilgrimage sites throughout the world. These are places where the friends of God, as they're called in Muslim traditions, the people who are spiritually intimate with God, are buried. In Tanta, Egypt, there is a famous Sufi figure by the name of Ahmad al-Badawi who's buried there. And every year, his tomb draws hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. It's not unique in the Muslim world. There's sites like this scattered everywhere. Certain groups, though, like the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia, believe that this is idol worship and will destroy places like this. And this, I think, emphasizes the fact that there are a multitude of ways in which one can see and act out being Muslim.
This leads to our discussion on ritual practice and lived religion. Dancing, chanting the names of God, taking pilgrimages to a Sufi tomb are all examples of ritual practice. Religion is often thought of as just beliefs and doctrines, but ritual practice forms an integral part of religion, and Muslims practice a wide variety of rituals, as we've seen with the Sufis.
When we look at the diversity of practices, we understand that we can't just limit ourselves to a so-called 5-pillar definition of Islam. The 5-pillar definition allows the Sunni narrative to dominate. For example, Ismaili Shia have 7 pillars, and Shia thought in general distinguishes between necessary thoughts and necessary actions, which the 5-pillar approach doesn't allow for. But let's recap the 5 pillars because this is something that very many Muslims will refer to themselves. The first is the Shahada. The Shahada is the declaration of faith, a belief that there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger of God. For Shia, they will also add that Ali is the successor to Muhammad. We can also talk about Salat, or prayer. And here, prayer, we mean the 5 times a day liturgical prayers that is common across very many Muslim communities. Next is zakat. Often translated as charity, zakat is believed to really just be the bare minimum of giving. There are other words for charity that involve more than zakat. Then we turn to fasting, or saum. And fasting is often described or related to the fast that Muslims participate in during the month of Ramadan from sun up to sun down. And finally, we turn to Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca, that all able-bodied Muslims should intend to make at least once in their lifetime. We think it's better if we look at the 5 pillars as a bare minimum understanding. What happens if you want to give more than the zakat for charity? What happens if you want to do more pilgrimages than the Hajj? Or perhaps more importantly, when we look at the Hajj, only about 2 million people can go on Hajj a year. So what happens if you physically can't fulfill an obligation? When we think about the 5 pillars, we look at it as a starting point for conversation, not a totality of what it means to be Muslim. So what we see in all this diversity is that there is something that binds all Muslims together, which is the belief in one God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Out of that, we can see Groups like the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia practicing their nihilism, the philanthropy of the Aga Khan Development Network, or the social justice advocacy of the Nation of Islam. All these groups approach their Islam differently, but all are bound by this common belief.
The third aspect of religious literacy is that religions are embedded in all aspects of culture. This is to say that religion is not some discrete private affair separated from public life, but is in fact in every aspect of public life. Dr. Diane Moore says it best. We continuously hear that's political Islam, it's not religious Islam, or that's political Buddhism, not religious Buddhism. What does it mean? That religion doesn't affect political life, or that politics doesn't affect religion? You can't separate them. That's an arbitrary distinction that doesn't have a basis in reality. The point being, any religion can be an influencing factor in these different arenas of culture, whether it's in politics or in art or in business. Whenever you hear someone say, oh, that's cultural, not religious, you're buying into this myth that religion is somehow ahistorical and separated from its cultural context. In the words of the Harvard Religious Literacy Project, when studying any religion, we need to understand them as they arose out of and continue to be shaped by particular social, historical, and cultural contexts.
So when we think about the interaction between politics and religion and how it applies to Islam, perhaps there's no better case study than that of Sharia. For many in the West, Sharia tends to evoke scary images or scary thoughts of a puritanical religious law. But Sharia is not a codified book that one picks up off the shelf that tells you how to act. It literally means a path to water. If you think about the fact that earlier we spoke about Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, one of the things in the 7 verses is a request to God to guide Muslims to the right path. And so Sharia is sort of that guide to what is the right path. As a result, Sharia is more than law. It's about ethics, it's about morals, it's about customs and the ways in which you should live your life. It is about how you feed the poor, how you take care of the needy, how you pray, what food you're allowed to eat and not allowed to eat. It tells you how to get married. It tells you how to raise your children. And these are all things that are not in a sense of thou shalt do this, but is part of a tradition where people are constantly arguing with each other as to what this means. With the rise of the modern nation state, we now see Sharia becoming the law of the land for very particular countries. And as a result, we tend to think of it now with places like Saudi Arabia and this puritanical religious law. For the vast majority of Muslims, though, this simply means, how do I live to be a good person and the best person I can be while being a believing Muslim?
Most discussions about Sharia fail to recognize how amorphous and malleable it can be. Like Dr. Rashid said, there is no book of Sharia that you can go consult. The primary sources of Sharia are the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, and the interpretations of these sources is called fiqh, or jurisprudence. And this is open for debate and differs based on historical and cultural context. The scholar Knysh Ali says, Sharia is also largely theoretical. Muslims believe that God has communicated to humanity through prophets and scriptures, but knowing exactly which rules to apply, to whom, and in what circumstances requires interpretation. Interpretation requires interpreters who, as people, are fallible and disagree with one another. And some of these interpretations are very problematic. Like Dr. Rashid said, some Muslim-majority countries, such as Saudi Arabia, have famously codified Sharia law into, for example, laws banning women from driving. Apostasy laws exist that have recently punished bloggers for insulting Islam or simply being atheist. And extremist non-state groups like the Taliban and ISIS have also implemented their interpretation of Sharia to lead to human rights violations like mutilations and honor killings.
There are state and non-state actors that try to craft a Sharia that serves their ends. We have to ask, what ends does it achieve for them? What is the political and social context? So, for example, why does Saudi Arabia prevent women from driving? But Iran not only allows women to drive, but has a high percentage of women serving in the national government, or one of the highest percentages of women in higher education in the entire region. We also have to look at the ways in which Muslims are invested in Sharia for creating positive change on a societal level. For example, in Malaysia, there's a group called Sisters in Islam, which is using Sharia to advocate and generate more rights for women in societies that have been using the cover of religion to enforce a patriarchal agenda. As we begin to think about what Sharia means, we have to be careful not to get caught up in what state needs are, or the nation state needs, but think about what it means to the average Muslim. The vast majority of Muslims conceive of and act with Sharia as a code of conduct. for how to live the best lives that they possibly can, to be contributing members of their communities and of their societies, and to try to build better lives for themselves. The Muslim theologian and professor Jerusha Lamte said, Sharia is part of Islam, and Sharia is important to Muslims. But Sharia is not a codified, static, or agreed upon collection of laws. Sharia is better understood as guiding principles according to which Muslims attempt to live these lives. And so what we have to understand is that Sharia is adaptive and continues to adapt and evolve. And in the 21st century, we see a wide variety of Muslim communities using Sharia to advance particular ends and goals, both for themselves and for their broader communities.
Overall, Islam is just too big of a topic to cover in one video, but if there is one thing that you can take away from this, is that Islam is not an ahistorical, monolithic tradition that's divorced from its cultural contexts. Islam has evolved over time, it's incredibly diverse, and it's embedded in cultures worldwide.
We hope we've inspired you to dig deeper into this topic, and so we've included resources from scholars of Islam below. And as always, thank you for watching.
I couldn't have made this video without the help of Dr. Hussein Rashid, so thank you so much for your expertise. Also, this was made with the help of the Religious Freedom Center in Washington, D.C., a non-sectarian organization dedicated to education about religious literacy and religious liberty. So head on over to their website here to check out their online courses. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.